The darkness pressed against Keturah's cabin like a living thing, thick with the August heat that clung to northern Florida's cypress swamps, even in the dead of night. She jerked awake to the sound of desperate fists pounding against her door, the wooden planks rattling on their leather hinges with an urgency that sent ice through her veins, despite the oppressive warmth. Keturah. Keturah, wake up! The voice belonged to Tobias, barely 17 and still carrying the frightened tremor of someone who hadn't yet learned to bury his fear deep enough. Master says, come quick, Mistress Cordelia's time has come. She was already moving before full consciousness returned, her body responding to decades of midnight summons with practiced efficiency. Her bare feet found the rough-hewn floorboards as she reached for the leather satchel that never strayed far from her bedside. The tools of her trade, clean rags, herbs, a sharp knife wrapped in oilcloth, and the small bottle of laudanum she'd managed to save from the last birth, were always ready. They had to be. 3 weeks early, she murmured to herself, opening the door to find Tobias shifting nervously from foot to foot, his dark skin glistening with sweat in the moonlight. Behind him, the Blackwater Plantation stretched out like a kingdom built on suffering, the main house glowing with lamplight against the backdrop of Spanish moss that draped from the ancient live oaks like funeral shrouds. Yes'm, Tobias whispered, glancing over his shoulder toward the overseer's cabin, where Silas Grimm's bloodhounds had begun their restless whining. Master Thaddeus, he's been drinking something fierce. Says if anything happens to the mistress. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. Keturah had delivered 43 babies in her 32 years of life. She'd brought children into this world for plantation wives who would never know hunger, and for enslaved women whose newborns would be property before they drew their first breath. She'd guided life into the world with hands that had also prepared the dead for burial, including 3 small bodies that had once grown beneath her own heart. The memory of her children, Patience, born blue and still, little Samuel sold away at 8 months, and Sweet Mercy taken by fever at 2 years old, rose unbidden as she stepped into the humid night air. Their ghosts walked with her always, but tonight they seemed closer somehow. Their whispered voices carried on the breeze that stirred the Spanish moss into writhing shadows. Tell me true. Tobias? She said as they began walking toward the main house, her voice steady despite the dread pooling in her stomach. How long has she been laboring? Since just after midnight, I think. Magnolia sent me to fetch you when the pains got bad. He cast another nervous glance toward the overseer's cabin, where one of the bloodhounds had begun to howl, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo from the swamp itself. Something ain't right tonight, Miss Keturah. The animals have been acting strange all day. Even the chickens won't roost properly. She'd noticed it too, though she hadn't spoken of it. The natural world had its own language, and those who lived close to the earth learned to read its warnings. This morning, she'd found 3 dead mockingbirds arranged in a perfect line outside her cabin door. This afternoon, the Spanish moss had hung so still it seemed frozen, despite the oppressive heat that should have stirred every leaf. And just before sunset, she'd watched an owl call out in broad daylight from the direction of the family cemetery, its voice carrying an urgency that made her skin crawl. Now, as they walked the worn path between the slave quarters and the main house, more signs revealed themselves. Fireflies blinked and died mid-flight, falling to the earth like tiny falling stars. The night sounds of the swamp, the chorus of frogs and insects that usually provided a constant backdrop, had fallen into an unnatural silence broken only by the distant baying of Grimm's hounds. If you're drawn into this haunting tale of psychological horror set in 1828 Florida, subscribe now to follow Keturah's terrifying journey and discover how desperation can drive someone to unthinkable acts. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what omens you've noticed that gave you chills. We read every single one. The Blackwater Plantation house loomed before them like a monument to cruelty disguised as prosperity. Built from cypress and heart pine dragged from the surrounding swamps, it stood 2 stories tall with wide verandas designed to catch any whisper of breeze. Tonight every window blazed with lamplight, and she could see figures moving behind the curtains like shadows in a fever dream. Master Thaddeus Blackwater had inherited this land from his father, along with the 200 souls who worked it. Keturah remembered the old master, a hard man but predictable in his cruelty. Thaddeus was different. Where his father had been coldly practical, Thaddeus was given to fits of rage that could turn deadly without warning. The scars on her back, long healed but never forgotten, testified to his unpredictable nature. Keturah, Tobias whispered as they approached the wide front steps. What if she dies? What if the baby dies? The question hung in the humid air like a physical weight. They both knew the answer, though neither would speak it aloud. Master Blackwater had already lost 2 children in previous pregnancies, both blamed on what he called the curse that followed Keturah's hands. If Mistress Cordelia died tonight, if this baby joined the others in the small cemetery behind the house, there would be a reckoning. Hush now, she said, though her own heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Women have been birthing babies since Eve. Most times everything goes just fine. But even as she spoke the reassuring words, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. Glancing up at the second-story window, she caught a glimpse of a pale face pressed against the glass. Mistress Cordelia, her features twisted with pain. For just a moment their eyes met across the distance, and Keturah felt something cold settle in her bones. There was recognition in that gaze and something else, something that looked almost like an accusation. The Spanish moss stirred without any wind to move it, and somewhere in the darkness of the swamp, a child's voice called out, high and sweet and impossible. Keturah's breath caught in her throat as the sound faded into nothing, leaving only the renewed howling of the hounds and the oppressive weight of the night pressing down upon them all. She climbed the front steps that no enslaved person was allowed to use except in cases of emergency, her worn leather satchel clutched in hands that had learned to remain steady, even when her heart threatened to burst from fear. Behind her, the night seemed to whisper warnings in voices she recognized, the voices of children who would never grow old, calling her name in a wind that touched nothing else. Tonight, she would bring life into the world or watch it slip away. Tonight she would face whatever reckoning awaited her in the lamplit rooms of the big house. But first she would do what she had always done. She would tend to the woman in labor, regardless of the cost to herself. The heavy oak door opened before she could knock, revealing Magnolia's weathered face etched with worry. The older woman had been house servant to 3 generations of Blackwater wives, and her dark eyes held the accumulated weight of all the secrets she'd kept and all the sorrows she'd witnessed. She's been calling for you, Magnolia whispered, stepping aside to let Keturah enter the mahogany-paneled hallway that reeked of beeswax and bourbon. Been calling your name since the pain started strong. Ain't natural, the things she's been saying. As Keturah crossed the threshold into the oppressive grandeur of the master's house, she felt the eyes of the portrait gallery upon her, generations of Blackwater men and women who had built their fortune on human misery. Their painted faces seemed to follow her movement, and she could swear she heard the whispered voices of her lost children echoing from the walls themselves. Whatever awaited her in the birthing chamber above, she knew with cold certainty that this night would change everything. The omens had been clear, written in dead birds and dying fireflies, in the unnatural silence of the swamp, and the restless howling of hounds that sensed what human eyes could not yet see. Death walked the halls of Blackwater Plantation tonight, and it wore a familiar face. The interior of the Blackwater mansion wrapped around Keturah like a silk-lined coffin, its opulence a stark reminder of the human cost that had purchased every crystal chandelier and mahogany banister. The hallway stretched before her, lit by whale oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across portraits of long-dead Blackwater ancestors. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her movement, judging her worthiness to walk upon. Persian rugs that cost more than most enslaved people would earn in several lifetimes if they had been permitted to earn anything at all. Magnolia moved with the silent efficiency of someone who had learned to become invisible in her own home. At 63, she had served as head house servant since before Keturah was born, her gray hair wrapped in a pristine white kerchief that never showed a wrinkle despite the chaos that often reigned within these walls. She had delivered Thaddeus Blackwater himself 38 years ago, had raised him when his mother proved more interested in laudanum than motherhood, and had watched him transform from a spoiled child into a man whose cruelty surpassed even his father's cold pragmatism. "How long since the waters broke?" Keturah asked in hushed tones as they climbed the curved staircase, each step muffled by carpet thick enough to muffle screams. "Nearly an hour ago," Magnolia replied, her voice carrying the weight of experience with difficult births. "But something ain't right about this one, Keturah. She's been speaking in tongues, calling out names I ain't never heard. And the bleeding?" She paused, her weathered hand gripping the banister with white knuckles. "It ain't the normal kind." From somewhere above came the sound of Cordelia's labored breathing, punctuated by low moans that seemed to echo through the house like the cries of something trapped. But underneath those sounds, Keturah caught something else. The heavy tread of Master Blackwater's boots as he paced the upstairs hallway, each footstep marking time like a countdown to judgment. The second-floor hallway stretched in both directions, lined with doors that led to bedrooms where 3 generations of Blackwater children had been born, lived, and died. Gas lamps flickered along the walls, their yellow light revealing wallpaper imported from France, delicate roses and birds that seemed to mock the thorns and cages that defined life on the plantation. The air here was thick with the scent of beeswax candles, bourbon, and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded Keturah of flowers left too long on a grave. "Where is he?" she asked, though the steady pacing above answered her question. "Been walking the floor since midnight," Magnolia whispered, drinking his father's brandy and talking to himself. "Keeps saying how this one's got to live, how he can't lose another heir." Her dark eyes met Keturah's with a look that conveyed volumes. "He's been asking questions about you, Keturah. About the other babies that didn't make it." The words hit her like a physical blow, though she'd been expecting them. Thaddeus Blackwater had never forgotten that she'd been present at both previous births. The son who'd lived only 3 days, blue and struggling, and the daughter who'd never drawn breath at all. In his grief and rage, he'd convinced himself that Keturah carried some kind of curse, that her presence brought death to white babies while enslaved children continued to be born healthy under her care. The truth was more complicated and infinitely more tragic. Keturah remembered every detail of those births, every desperate moment when she'd made split-second decisions about who to save when saving both wasn't possible. The first time, she'd chosen the white child over the enslaved woman laboring in the cabin beside the stables. The baby had died anyway, and she'd been left with the knowledge that she'd let Bertha die for nothing. The second time, faced with a similar choice, she'd tried to save both mother and child. She'd failed at both, and Master Blackwater had taken his grief out on her back with a riding crop that left scars she still carried. "He blames me," she said quietly, more to herself than to Magnolia. "He blames everyone but himself and his God," the older woman replied with bitter wisdom. "But mostly he blames you." They reached the master bedroom door, and Keturah could hear Cordelia's voice more clearly now. Not just the moans of labor pain, but actual words spoken in a voice made strange by fever and desperation. "The children by the water," Cordelia was saying, her cultured Virginia accent distorted by whatever visions plagued her. "They're calling to me, Magnolia. Do you hear them? They know my baby's name already. They know—" Keturah's blood turned to ice. Through the heavy oak door, she could hear Cordelia speaking with increasing agitation, and what she heard next made her grip her leather satchel so tightly her knuckles went white. "Mercy," Cordelia cried out, her voice rising to nearly a shriek. "Little Mercy is crying for her mama. Why won't you let her mama come? Why won't you let Keturah's baby girl come home?" Magnolia's face went ashen. She stared at Keturah with eyes wide with shock and something approaching terror. Neither woman spoke for a long moment, the impossible words hanging in the air between them like an accusation. Keturah's youngest daughter had been named Mercy. Mercy, who'd died of fever at 2 years old, who'd been buried in the slave cemetery without even a wooden marker to remember her brief life. Mercy, whose name Keturah had never spoken aloud in the main house, whose existence the Blackwater family had never acknowledged or cared to learn about. There was no way Cordelia could know that name. "How could she?" Magnolia began, but her words were cut off by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Master Thaddeus appeared at the far end of the hallway, his tall frame swaying slightly as he walked. Even in the lamplight, Keturah could see that his usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his dark hair hanging loose around his shoulders, his white shirt stained with sweat and spilled liquor, his pale blue eyes, so much like his wife's, fixed on Keturah with an intensity that made her skin crawl. At 38, Thaddeus Blackwater still possessed the lean build of his youth, but years of drinking and the weight of maintaining his family's brutal legacy had carved cruel lines around his mouth and eyes. He was handsome in the way that predators were handsome, beautiful and terrible and utterly without mercy. "So," he said, his cultured voice slurred just enough to make it dangerous, "the angel of death arrives at last." Keturah lowered her eyes, adopting the posture of submission that had kept her alive for 32 years. "Master Blackwater, I came as soon as Tobias fetched me. How long has the mistress been in labor?" "Long enough," he snapped, moving closer with the unpredictable gait of a man whose emotions were held in check only by alcohol and force of will. "Long enough for her to start speaking in riddles about dead children and calling out names she's never heard before." His eyes narrowed as he studied Keturah's face. Interesting names. Familiar names. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Keturah felt sweat break out along her spine despite the chill that seemed to have settled in her bones. "Master, I should see the mistress. Early labor can be dangerous." "Dangerous," he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue like a curse. "Yes, everything seems to be dangerous when you're involved, doesn't it, Keturah? My son died 3 days ago. My daughter, stillborn. And now my wife lies in there speaking the name of your dead bastard child like they were sisters." The casual cruelty of his words, calling Mercy a bastard, reducing her brief life to nothing more than an inconvenience, sent a surge of rage through Keturah's chest so fierce she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from speaking. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth as she forced herself to remain silent. From inside the bedroom came another cry from Cordelia, this one wordless but filled with such anguish that even Thaddeus flinched. Whatever was happening in that room, it was growing worse. "If anything happens to her," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shouts, "if I lose this baby the way I lost the others, I'll know exactly who to blame. And this time, Keturah, there won't be any mercy for you. Do you understand me?" She met his eyes for just a moment, long enough to see the grief and desperation lurking beneath his anger. Thaddeus Blackwater was afraid. Afraid of losing another child, afraid of facing another failure, afraid of the whispers that followed plantation families who couldn't produce healthy heirs. His fear made him dangerous in a way that simple cruelty never could. "I understand, Master," she said quietly. Another scream from behind the bedroom door made them all freeze. This one was different, sharper, more urgent. The sound of a woman approaching the final stages of labor, whether she was ready or not. "Go," Thaddeus commanded, stepping aside but not before leaning close enough for Keturah to smell the bourbon on his breath. "Save them both, or God help you, you'll join your bastard children in the ground before morning." As Magnolia opened the bedroom door, Keturah caught a glimpse of what waited inside. Cordelia thrashing on blood-soaked sheets, her pale hair plastered to her skull with sweat, her eyes wild with pain and something that looked disturbingly like recognition when they fixed on Keturah's face. "You came," Cordelia gasped, reaching out with one trembling hand. "I knew you would come. Mercy told me you would." The impossible words followed Keturah into the birthing chamber like a curse, and as the door closed behind her, she heard Thaddeus resume his pacing in the hallway outside, each footstep a reminder that her life hung in the balance along with the lives of mother and child. In the flickering candlelight of the bedroom, surrounded by the oppressive luxury that had been built on the broken backs of her people, Keturah opened her leather satchel and prepared to face whatever dark miracle awaited her in the long hours until dawn. The master bedroom enveloped Keturah in an atmosphere of fevered desperation that seemed to pulse with each of Cordelia's labored breaths. Heavy velvet drapes blocked out the night, while dozens of candles cast writhing shadows across walls papered in silk damask the color of dried blood. The air was thick with the competing scents of magnolia blossoms, cut fresh from the plantation gardens and arranged in crystal vases throughout the room, and the metallic smell of birth fluids that no amount of perfumed luxury could mask. Cordelia Blackwater lay propped against pillows of the finest goose down, her nightgown soaked through with sweat despite the expensive lace that trimmed its collar and sleeves. At 24, she still possessed the delicate beauty that had made her the prize of Richmond society before her marriage to Thaddeus. But labor had transformed her porcelain features into something wild and otherworldly. Her pale blonde hair hung in damp tendrils around a face flushed with fever, and her blue eyes, so like her husband's, darted constantly around the room as if tracking movements visible only to her. "The water children are singing again," Cordelia whispered as Keturah approached the massive four-poster bed that dominated the room. "Do you hear them, Keturah? They know you're here now. They've been waiting." Magnolia, who had been dabbing Cordelia's forehead with a cool cloth, shot Keturah a look that mixed fear with desperate hope. "She's been like this for the past hour," the older woman murmured. getting worse as the pains come stronger. Keturah set her leather satchel on the mahogany table beside the bed and began removing her supplies with practiced efficiency. Clean rags, her sharpest knife, the precious bottle of laudanum, and the small collection of herbs she'd gathered from the swamp, pennyroyal for bleeding, red raspberry leaf for strengthening contractions, and bloodroot for pain. As her hands moved automatically through the familiar preparations, her mind raced to assess what she could observe about Cordelia's condition. The bleeding was heavier than normal for this stage of labor, and the sheets beneath Cordelia showed dark stains that spoke of complications Keturah had seen before. The baby was coming early, which often meant trouble, and from the way Cordelia's abdomen contracted and released, the child was likely positioned wrong. "Let me examine you, Mistress Cordelia," Keturah said gently, washing her hands in the basin of hot water Magnolia had prepared. "I need to see how the baby is situated." As her hands moved to check Cordelia's progress, the young woman's fingers suddenly clamped around Keturah's wrist with surprising strength. Despite her delirium, Cordelia's grip was firm, and her eyes, when they fixed on Keturah's face, were startlingly lucid. "She forgives you," Cordelia whispered, her voice so low that only Keturah could hear. "Your little Mercy. She wants you to know she forgives you for not being there when the fever took her. She understands you were saving other babies." The words hit Keturah like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She had been at a birth in the overseer's cabin the night Mercy died, tending to Silas Grimm's wife while her own daughter burned with fever in the slave quarters. By the time she'd returned, Mercy was gone, and the guilt had eaten at her soul every day since. There was no possible way Cordelia could know these details. "How?" Keturah began, but her words were cut off by another of Cordelia's contractions. The young woman's back arched off the bed as the pain seized her, and her scream filled the room with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. As the contraction passed, Keturah forced herself to focus on the medical emergency at hand. Her examination confirmed her worst fears. The baby was breached, positioned feet first instead of head down. Worse, the umbilical cord was wrapped around something, restricting the blood flow that kept the child alive. Without immediate intervention, both mother and baby would likely die within the hour. "Magnolia," she said quietly, "I need more light, and bring me the strongest spirits Master Blackwater has. The baby needs to be turned, and it's going to be painful." As Magnolia hurried to gather more candles and locate the brandy, Keturah found herself alone with Cordelia, who had fallen into a strange, restless quiet between contractions. The young woman's eyes were fixed on a corner of the room where shadows gathered despite the abundance of candles. "She's standing right there," Cordelia murmured, her voice dreamy and distant. "Your daughter. She's so beautiful, Keturah. So much like you, but with her father's eyes." Keturah's hands still in their work. Mercy had indeed inherited her father's eyes. Unusual golden brown eyes that had made it impossible to hide her parentage from the other enslaved people, though the father's identity had never been spoken aloud. Samuel, the plantation carpenter, had been sold away shortly after Mercy's birth, and Keturah had never seen those distinctive eyes again, until now, reflected in Cordelia's fevered gaze as she stared at empty air. "Tell me what you see," Keturah heard herself say, though every rational part of her mind screamed that encouraging such delusions was dangerous. "She's wearing a yellow dress," Cordelia continued, her voice taking on an odd sing-song quality, "the one you made for her second birthday, with the little flowers embroidered on the collar. She says you saved the fabric from scraps and worked on it by candlelight after your other duties were done. Are you captivated by this chilling tale of supernatural horror and historical tragedy? Don't miss what happens next as Keturah faces an impossible choice between the living and the dead. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced something that couldn't be explained? We love hearing your mysterious encounters." Keturah's vision blurred as tears threatened to fall. She had made that dress, had spent weeks collecting scraps of yellow cotton from the sewing room, had embroidered tiny daisies around the collar by the light of a single candle. Mercy had worn it exactly once to the harvest celebration, before outgrowing it a month later. The sound of glass breaking somewhere in the house made them both jump. From the hallway came the muffled sound of Thaddeus cursing, followed by the crash of something heavy hitting the floor. His pacing had grown more erratic as the night wore on, and Keturah could hear the dangerous edge in his voice even through the thick bedroom door. Another contraction seized Cordelia, this one stronger than the last. As she writhed in pain, the candles around the room began to flicker wildly despite the absence of any breeze. One by one, they guttered out until only half remained burning, throwing the room into a twilight of dancing shadows. "Something's wrong," Magnolia whispered as she returned with an armload of fresh candles and a bottle of French brandy. "The flames keep dying and I can't get them to stay lit. Even the gas lamps in the hallway are acting strange." Keturah tried to focus on relighting the candles, but as soon as she touched flame to wick, the new candles would burn for a few moments before extinguishing themselves. The room grew steadily dimmer, and in the shifting shadows, she began to see things that couldn't be there. Small movements in her peripheral vision, the suggestion of a child-sized figure watching from the darkened corners. "The baby's in distress," she announced, checking Cordelia's progress again. "The situation was deteriorating rapidly. I need to turn it now or we'll lose them both." She poured brandy over her hands and instruments, the alcohol stinging the small cuts and calluses that marked a lifetime of hard labor. As she prepared to attempt the dangerous maneuver that might save the baby's life, Cordelia's hand found hers again. "She says to tell you about the day she died," Cordelia whispered, her eyes now completely focused on the empty corner where she claimed to see Mercy. "How she wasn't afraid because she knew you'd come for her eventually. How she's been waiting by the water for you to find your way back to her." The words were like daggers in Keturah's heart, but she forced herself to concentrate on the task at hand. She had to reach inside Cordelia and manually turn the baby, a procedure that was as dangerous as it was painful. If she made a mistake, if the cord tightened further or if she caused internal bleeding, both patients would die. As her hands began the delicate work of repositioning the unborn child, the remaining candles in the room suddenly flared to brilliant life, casting everything in stark relief. In that moment of blazing illumination, Keturah saw her clearly. A small figure in a yellow dress standing beside the bed, translucent but unmistakably real. Mercy's golden brown eyes met her mother's gaze across the impossible distance between life and death, and she smiled the same sweet smile that had lit up their cramped cabin during her brief time on Earth. Then the candles returned to normal, and the vision was gone, leaving only Cordelia's fevered whispers and the sound of Thaddeus's increasingly agitated pacing in the hallway beyond. "Almost there," Keturah murmured. Whether to Cordelia or to the ghost of her daughter or to herself, she couldn't say. Just hold on a little longer. But even as she worked to save the lives in her hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that something far more complex than a difficult birth was unfolding in the candlelit bedroom. The boundary between the living and the dead seemed to be thinning with each passing moment. And whatever was coming would demand a price that went far beyond the simple act of bringing a child into the world. In the shadows that gathered beyond the circle of candlelight, she could hear the echo of children's laughter, and she knew with cold certainty that before this night was over, she would have to choose between the living and the dead, and that choice would damn her soul regardless of what she decided. The clock on the mahogany mantelpiece chimed 3 times, its bronze notes echoing through the birthing chamber like a funeral bell. Keturah had been working for nearly 2 hours to turn the baby, her hands cramping from the delicate manipulation required to coax new life into proper position, without severing the umbilical cord that had become a noose around the child's neck. Sweat dripped from her forehead despite the strange chill that had settled over the room, and her arms ached from the constant, careful pressure needed to guide the infant toward birth. Cordelia's condition was deteriorating with frightening speed. Her pulse had grown weak and threaded beneath Keturah's fingers, and the bleeding had increased to a flow that stained the expensive silk sheets crimson. The young woman drifted in and out of consciousness, her moments of lucidity filled with whispered conversations with invisible children, her periods of delirium marked by thrashing that threatened to undo all of Keturah's careful work. "She's losing too much blood," Magnolia whispered, wringing out another cloth that came away dark red. The older woman's hands shook as she worked, and her usually composed features showed the strain of watching a birth spiral toward tragedy. "I saw this before, child. See what happens when the bleeding won't stop." Keturah knew what Magnolia meant, had witnessed it herself more times than she cared to remember. Women who bled out during childbirth, their life flowing away faster than any midwife could stanch it, leaving behind motherless babies and grieving families. But losing Cordelia meant more than personal tragedy. It meant facing Thaddeus Blackwater's rage, and this time there would be no mercy. The sound of splintering wood came from the hallway, followed by Thaddeus's voice raised in incoherent fury. He had been drinking steadily since midnight, and his pacing had grown increasingly violent. Twice already, Magnolia had slipped out to report on Cordelia's progress, and each time she returned, her face was more drawn with worry. "He's talking about the curse again," she had whispered after her last trip to the hallway. "Says if this baby dies, he'll know for certain you've been hexing his bloodline. Says there'll be a reckoning at dawn." Now, as Keturah worked desperately to save both mother and child, she could feel the weight of that promised reckoning pressing down upon her like a physical thing. Every movement of her hands was monitored by the specter of her own death. Every decision measured against the knowledge that failure would mean more than professional shame. It would mean the end of everything. The baby had finally turned, but the cord remained dangerously tight around its neck. Each contraction that should have brought the child closer to birth instead threatened to strangle it in the womb. Keturah faced an impossible choice: attempt to deliver the baby quickly and risk tearing the cord or Cordelia's cervix, or try to loosen the cord first and watch both patients weaken beyond recovery. "Tell me what to do," she whispered into the candlelit darkness, unsure if she was speaking to God, to her ancestors, or to the ghost of her daughter, who seemed to hover just beyond sight. "Show me how to save them." As if in answer to her desperate prayer, Cordelia's eyes snapped open with sudden, terrifying clarity. Despite her blood loss and fever, her gaze was sharp and focused as it fixed on Keturah's face. "You can't save us both," Cordelia said in a voice that was eerily calm. "That's what she's been trying to tell you. Your little mercy. She's been showing me the paths through the darkness, and they don't lead to the same place." Keturah's hands stilled in their work. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you have to choose," Cordelia continued, her pale lips curving in a smile that held no warmth. "Save me and let my baby die, or save the baby and watch me bleed out on these silk sheets." "But you can't have both. The debt is too old, too deep. Payment has to be made." "That's not true," Keturah protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "I can deliver the baby safely if I can just—" "Look at me," Cordelia interrupted, and there was something in her tone that compelled obedience. "Really look at me, Keturah. Tell me what you see." Keturah's breath caught in her throat as she truly focused on Cordelia's face for the first time since entering the room. The candlelight threw harsh shadows across features that had grown gaunt with blood loss. But it was more than physical deterioration that made her appearance so disturbing. There was something else in Cordelia's eyes, an ancient knowledge that had no place in the face of a 24-year-old plantation wife. "You see it now, don't you?" Cordelia whispered. "I'm already dying. Have been since the labor started. The only question is whether I take my baby with me or leave something behind to carry on the Blackwater name." The terrible truth of it settled over Keturah like a shroud. She had known on some level that Cordelia's condition was beyond recovery. The bleeding was too severe and had been going on too long. Even if the baby was delivered safely, the young woman would likely die within the hour. But admitting that truth meant accepting an even more horrific reality, that she would have to make a conscious choice about who lived and who died. "Your husband will kill me if you die," Keturah said quietly. "Yes." Cordelia agreed with that same unnaturally calm voice. "He will unless what?" Cordelia's smile widened, and in the flickering candlelight, her teeth seemed too sharp, too white. "Unless you make it look like an accident. Unless you help me die in a way that saves the baby and makes you look like a hero instead of a murderer." The words hung in the air between them like a serpent poised to strike. Keturah felt her world tilting on its axis as she understood what Cordelia was suggesting. Not just to let her die, to actively help her die while saving the baby, to become complicit in her own murder in order to survive Thaddeus's wrath. "I can't," Keturah breathed. "I won't." "Then we all die," Cordelia replied matter-of-factly. "Me, my baby, and you, because there's no path through this darkness that saves everyone, Keturah. Mercy tried to show me one, but even the dead can't work miracles." Another contraction seized Cordelia, and this time her scream was different. Weaker, more desperate. The baby's heartbeat, which Keturah had been monitoring by placing her ear against Cordelia's belly, was growing fainter. Time was running out for both patients, and every second of hesitation brought them closer to the kind of total tragedy that would ensure Keturah's death at dawn. She's right, came a small voice from the shadows beside the bed. Keturah's head snapped toward the sound, and there was Mercy. Not a fleeting glimpse this time, but a clear, unmistakable presence in her yellow dress with the embroidered flowers. Mama, she's right. You can't save them both. This isn't real, Keturah whispered, but even as she spoke the words, she knew they were false. Real or not, Mercy was there, her golden brown eyes filled with love and terrible wisdom. It is real, Mama, as real as anything else in this broken world. Mercy's translucent form moved closer to the bed, and Keturah could smell the faint scent of magnolia blossoms that had always clung to her daughter's hair. You tried to save everyone your whole life, but you can't. Sometimes the kindest thing is to choose who gets to live. I don't want to choose, Keturah said, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at her dead daughter's face. But you have to, Mercy replied gently, because if you don't choose, everyone dies. And then what was the point of any of it? What was the point of all the babies you saved? All the lives you brought into this world? From the hallway came the sound of breaking glass, followed by Thaddeus's roar of rage. His patience was wearing thin, and dawn was still hours away. When morning came, he would want answers, and if those answers weren't satisfactory, Keturah's blood would water the plantation soil alongside that of her patients. The baby can live, Cordelia said, her voice growing weaker with each word. If you help me die quickly, cleanly, the baby can survive. Thaddeus will mourn me, but he'll have his heir. You'll be the midwife who saved the Blackwater line when all seemed lost. And if I don't, then we all become ghosts together, Mercy answered from her place in the shadows. Is that what you want, Mama? To join me and Samuel and little Patience in the darkness? Keturah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 32 years of impossible choices pressing down upon her shoulders. How many times had she been forced to choose between lives? How many times had she been damned for saving the wrong person, or for failing to save anyone at all? But this was different. This time she wasn't just choosing who to save. She was choosing to become a killer in order to survive. The distinction felt important, even as the practical result remained the same. I need to think, she whispered. There's no time for thinking, Cordelia gasped as another contraction racked her body. Choose now, Keturah. Choose, or watch us all die together. In the candlelit chamber where luxury and suffering intertwined like lovers, surrounded by the ghosts of her own dead children and the specter of her own approaching doom, Keturah faced the choice that would define not just this night, but the remainder of her days on earth. And in the shadows beyond the dying candles, she could hear the whispered voices of all the children she had failed to save, calling her name like a prayer or a curse. Time fractured in the candlelit chamber, each second stretching into an eternity of moral anguish while simultaneously racing toward a dawn that would bring either salvation or execution. Keturah's hands trembled as she held them suspended above Cordelia's laboring form, caught between the impulse to heal and the terrible knowledge that healing might not be possible, that survival might require her to become something she had sworn never to be. The choice crystallized, with brutal clarity in her mind. Allow Cordelia to bleed to death naturally while trying to save the baby, risking both lives and her own when Thaddeus discovered the failure, or actively hasten Cordelia's death to ensure the baby's survival and her own continued existence. Neither path led to redemption, but one offered the possibility of tomorrow. Mama, Mercy's voice whispered from the shadows, sweet and patient as it had been in life. Sometimes the only way to save someone is to let someone else go. Cordelia's blue eyes, growing glassy with blood loss, fixed on Keturah's face with disturbing intensity. Do it, she breathed, her words barely audible above the sound of her husband's raging in the hallway. Please, don't let my baby die because you're afraid to be practical. The word practical hit Keturah like a slap. How many times had she heard that term used to justify the unjustifiable? Practical to sell children away from their mothers. Practical to work people to death in the cotton fields. Practical to sacrifice the weak for the strong. Now she was being asked to embrace that same cold logic, to become practical in a way that would stain her soul beyond recognition. But the alternative was death, not just her own, but the baby's as well. And what would be practical about that? What mercy would there be in allowing an innocent child to die, rather than making the hard choice that would save it? Magnolia, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. I need you to step outside for a moment. Tell Master Blackwater that the baby is coming, that we need privacy for the final push. The older woman's eyes widened with understanding and horror. She had been present at enough difficult births to recognize the signs of a midwife, about to make an unthinkable decision. "Keturah, child, you don't have to—" "Yes," Keturah interrupted, meeting Magnolia's gaze with eyes that had already accepted damnation. "I do, and you can't be here when it happens. For your own protection." Magnolia lingered for another moment, her weathered face etched with pain for what she knew was coming. Then she nodded slowly, kissed her fingertips and touched them to Keturah's forehead in a gesture of blessing or farewell. "May God forgive us all," she whispered and slipped from the room. Alone with Cordelia and the ghost that haunted the chamber, Keturah felt a strange calm descend upon her. The trembling in her hands ceased and her breathing steadied as she moved with the purposeful efficiency that had marked 32 years of midwifery. She had always been good in a crisis, had always been able to focus on the task at hand when lives hung in the balance. This was simply another crisis, another life-or-death decision made in the space between heartbeats. "Thank you," Cordelia whispered, and there was genuine gratitude in her voice. "My baby will live because of what you're doing." Keturah didn't respond. She couldn't afford to think about gratitude or consequences or the weight of what she was about to do. Instead, she focused on the technical aspects of the procedure. How to position her hands, how to apply pressure in just the right place to speed the bleeding that was already claiming Cordelia's life. It was a perverse reversal of everything she had learned about healing, but the techniques were identical. The only difference was intent. "Will you tell my child about me?" Cordelia asked as Keturah's hands found their position. "When they're old enough to understand, will you tell them that their mother loved them enough to die for them?" "Yes," Keturah promised, though she wondered if she would live long enough to keep that promise. Cordelia smiled, a genuine expression of peace that transformed her pale, blood-drained features into something almost beautiful. "Then do it quickly, before I lose my courage." Keturah closed her eyes and applied pressure to the places she knew would accelerate the hemorrhaging. It was not violent, not dramatic, simply a matter of medical knowledge turned to dark purpose. She felt Cordelia's pulse flutter beneath her fingers, felt the young woman's breathing grow shallow and rapid as her body fought a battle it was destined to lose. "Mama, look," Mercy's voice called softly from beside the bed. Keturah opened her eyes to see her daughter pointing toward the foot of the bed, where other translucent figures had begun to gather. She recognized them all. Patience, her firstborn who had never drawn breath. Samuel sold away as an infant, and dozens of other children she had delivered over the years. Babies who had died in their first days or weeks of life. They stood in silent witness to what was happening, their presence neither condemning nor approving, but simply acknowledging the terrible necessity of the moment. Death was no stranger to any of them, and they understood better than the living that survival sometimes required choices that defied moral categorization. "It's almost over," Keturah murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to Cordelia, to the gathered spirits, or to herself. The baby's heartbeat was growing stronger as its mother's grew weaker, a grotesque exchange of life force that violated every natural law she understood. Cordelia's eyes began to flutter closed, but she forced them open one last time to look at Keturah. "The baby," she gasped. "Save my baby." "I will," Keturah promised, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Whatever sins she was committing tonight, she would see them through to their completion. The baby would live, and that life would be her justification for everything that came after. Cordelia's final breath escaped in a whisper that might have been "thank you," or might have been something else entirely. Her body went limp against the blood-soaked pillows, and the room fell into a silence so profound that Keturah could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. But there was no time for mourning or reflection. The baby was still trapped within its dead mother's body, and every second of delay increased the risk of losing the one life she had chosen to save. Keturah reached for her sharpest knife, sterilized it quickly with the remaining brandy, and began the emergency procedure that would bring new life into the world at the cost of her own soul. The baby emerged blue and still, its tiny form slick with birth fluids and eerily silent. For a moment that lasted forever, Keturah feared that all her terrible choices had been for nothing, that she had murdered Cordelia for a child who was already dead. But then she saw the faint flutter of the infant's chest, the barely perceptible movement that indicated life still fought within the small body. She cleared the baby's airway with practiced efficiency, rubbed its back to stimulate breathing, and felt a surge of triumph when the child's first cry pierced the silence of the death chamber. It was a strong cry, healthy and indignant, the sound of a fighter who had no intention of surrendering to the darkness that had claimed so many before. "A son," she whispered to the empty air, cradling the baby against her chest as she cut and tied the umbilical cord. Master Blackwater has his heir. As if summoned by his child's cry, the sound of heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway, and Thaddeus's voice called out with desperate hope. "Is it over? Is my wife—" The door burst open before Keturah could respond, and Thaddeus Blackwater stood framed in the doorway like an avenging angel, his face wild with drink and expectation. His pale eyes took in the scene before him, his wife's still form on the bloodied bed, Keturah holding his newborn son, the scattered evidence of a birth that had gone catastrophically wrong. "Cordelia," he breathed, moving toward the bed with unsteady steps. "My God, what happened?" "The bleeding couldn't be stopped," Keturah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of her lie. "She died bringing your son into the world, Master. But the baby is strong and healthy. She saved him with her sacrifice." Thaddeus reached out with trembling fingers to touch his wife's face, and for a moment, grief replaced the rage that usually dominated his features. "She's really gone?" "Yes, Master. I'm sorry. I did everything I could." He stared at Cordelia's peaceful expression for a long moment, then turned his attention to the baby in Keturah's arms. The infant had stopped crying and was looking around with the unfocused gaze of the newly born, his tiny fists waving in the air as if grasping for a world he had yet to understand. "My son?" Thaddeus whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's cheek. "At least I have my son." Keturah handed the child to his father, watching as Thaddeus's face transformed with wonder and paternal love. In that moment, she saw what her terrible choice had purchased, not just her own survival, but the continuation of the Blackwater line and the preservation of a father's hope for the future. But as dawn began to creep through the heavy curtains, painting the death chamber in shades of gray and gold, she also understood the true cost of what she had done. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had become something that could never be undone. Whatever she was before this night, she was something different now. A killer who wore the mask of a healer, a murderer who would be praised as a hero. In the growing light of morning, the ghostly figures of the dead children began to fade, but Mercy lingered longest, her golden brown eyes filled with love and terrible understanding. "I'm proud of you, Mama," she whispered as her form grew translucent. "You saved the one you could save." Then she was gone, leaving Keturah alone with the living and the weight of choices that would follow her to her own grave, whenever that day might come. Dawn crept across the Blackwater plantation like a reluctant witness, its pale light filtering through the Spanish moss and casting long shadows across grounds that had been forever changed by the night's events. In the master bedroom, the scene had taken on the quality of a religious tableau, grief and joy intertwined. In the space where life and death had conducted their eternal dance, Thaddeus sat in the leather chair beside his wife's deathbed, cradling his newborn son against his chest while staring at Cordelia's peaceful face. The rage that had sustained him through the long night had been replaced by something more complex, a mixture of devastating loss and overwhelming relief that left him hollowed out and strangely vulnerable. His son was alive, healthy, and bore the unmistakable Blackwater features that would mark him as legitimate heir to the plantation's dark legacy. "What will you name him?" Keturah asked quietly as she finished cleaning the blood from her hands. She had worked methodically to restore order to the chamber, changing the bedsheets, arranging Cordelia's body in a position of dignified repose, and gathering the evidence of the night's medical emergency. To any observer, it would appear that she had fought valiantly to save both mother and child, succeeding with one and losing the other to the cruel mathematics of complicated childbirth. Cordelia wanted to name him after her father, if it was a boy, Thaddeus replied, his voice hoarse from drink and exhaustion. Harrison Blackwater." He looked down at the infant's face, studying the features that would grow to mirror his own. She said it was a strong name for a strong boy. The irony was not lost on Keturah, that this child, born from an act of deliberate murder, would bear the name his dead mother had chosen. Harrison would grow up believing his mother had died a hero's death, bringing him into the world, never knowing that his first breath had been purchased with her last. "It's a good name," she said, and meant it. Whatever sins had brought this child into being, he was innocent of them all. He deserved to live, to grow, to become something better than the circumstances of his birth. Magnolia appeared in the doorway, her face carefully composed, but her eyes revealing the strain of the past hours. She had spent the night in the kitchen, preparing the tea and broth that would be needed for recovery, staying busy to avoid thinking too deeply about what was happening in the chamber above. Now she took in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed both triumph and tragedy in equal measure. "Should I send a word to the Reverend?" she asked quietly. "And to Mistress Cordelia's family in Richmond?" Thaddeus nodded slowly, still unable to look away from his son's face. "Tell them she died bringing our heir into the world. Tell them she was brave until the end." He paused, then added with surprising gentleness, "And tell them the baby is healthy and strong. She would have wanted them to know that." As Magnolia withdrew to begin the grim business of death notifications, Keturah found herself alone with the master and his newborn heir. The weight of what she had done pressed down upon her like a physical thing, but alongside the guilt and horror, she felt something unexpected. A strange sense of completion, as if she had finally paid a debt that had been accumulating for decades. "You saved him," Thaddeus said suddenly, looking up at her with eyes that held none of their usual cruelty. "When everything went wrong, when I thought I would lose them both, you saved my son." "I did what I could," Keturah replied carefully. "I'm sorry I couldn't save them both." "No," he said, shaking his head. "Don't apologize. Cordelia knew the risks. We both did, after the other pregnancies. But Harrison is alive because of your skill, because you didn't give up when things looked hopeless." He stood, still holding the baby, and moved to the window where the morning light revealed the plantation, stretching out toward the distant swamp. "There will be no more talk of curses or hexes. You've proven your worth beyond question." The words should have brought relief, but instead they felt like acid in Keturah's veins. She had indeed proven her worth, had proven that she could commit murder and be praised for it, that she could cross any moral line if survival demanded it. The realization filled her with a sick mixture of triumph and self-loathing. "Master," she said quietly, "what about the burial arrangements?" "She'll be laid to rest in the family cemetery beside my parents," Thaddeus replied. "The finest funeral this county has ever seen. She deserves that much." He turned back to face Keturah, and for a moment she saw something almost like vulnerability in his expression. "Will you help me care for him? The boy will need someone who understands medicine, someone who can keep him healthy." The request was both practical and loaded with meaning. Thaddeus was offering her security, protection, a position of relative privilege within the plantation hierarchy. All she had to do was continue living with the knowledge of what she had done, continue caring for the child whose life had cost his mother's. "Of course," she heard herself say. "I'll do whatever is needed." As the morning wore on, word of Cordelia's death and Harrison's birth spread throughout the plantation like ripples in still water. The enslaved community received the news with the complex mixture of sympathy and detachment that characterized their response to all white family tragedies. Sorry for the human loss, but understanding that their own lives would continue unchanged regardless of who lived or died in the big house. But when Keturah returned to her cabin near midday, exhausted beyond measure and desperate for solitude, she found that escape from the night's events was impossible. Tobias was waiting for her, his young face etched with concern and something that might have been suspicion. "Miss Keturah," he said as she approached her door, "folks been talking about how you were the only one with the mistress when she died, about how convenient it was that the baby lived when everyone expected them both to pass." The words hit her like cold water, washing away any illusion that her secret was safe. She had underestimated the enslaved community's ability to read between the lines, to understand the subtext of events that white people accepted at face value. "People talk about many things," she replied carefully. "That doesn't make their talk true." "No, ma'am," Tobias agreed. "But it doesn't make it false either." He studied her face with eyes that seemed older than his 17 years. "Whatever happened in that room, whatever choices got made, just know that some of us understand. Sometimes there ain't no good choices, only necessary ones. The sympathy in his voice was almost harder to bear than the accusation would have been. Keturah found herself fighting back tears as she realized that her community, her people, had already judged her actions and found them, if not forgivable, then at least understandable. They knew what survival looked like in a world that offered no mercy to those without power. "The baby lives," she said quietly. "That's what matters." "Yes, ma'am," Tobias replied. "The baby lives, and so do you. In a place like this, sometimes that's the best outcome you can hope for." He walked away without another word, leaving Keturah alone with her thoughts and the growing understanding that her actions had reverberations far beyond the walls of the master bedroom. She had not just saved a child and ensured her own survival. She had demonstrated to an entire community that even the powerless could seize moments of agency and could make choices that defied the expectations of their oppressors. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of routine and barely suppressed emotion. Harrison thrived under Keturah's care, growing stronger and more alert with each passing hour. Thaddeus proved to be a devoted father, spending hours simply watching his son sleep or holding him while he fed. The grief over Cordelia's death was real and profound, but it was tempered by the joy of fatherhood and the knowledge that his bloodline would continue. Cordelia's funeral was indeed the grandest the county had ever witnessed. Carriages arrived from Richmond bearing her family and childhood friends, all eager to pay their respects to the young woman who had died in the service of motherhood. The Reverend spoke eloquently of sacrifice and divine will, painting Cordelia's death as a noble offering that had purchased new life for the plantation. Keturah stood with the other enslaved people at the back of the gathering, watching as Cordelia's casket was lowered into the earth beside generations of Blackwater ancestors. The eulogy spoke of courage and maternal love, of a woman who had given everything to ensure her child's survival. It was a beautiful lie, and Keturah found herself wondering if perhaps all eulogies were beautiful lies, stories we told ourselves to make sense of senseless loss. As autumn settled over the plantation and baby Harrison grew from newborn to infant, Keturah began to understand the true price of her defiance. She had gained security and status, had saved a life and ensured her own survival, but she had also lost something essential: the ability to see herself as purely a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She was now an active participant in the plantation's cycle of violence, a collaborator who had chosen survival over moral purity. The ghosts that had haunted her during that terrible night never returned, but she felt their presence in quieter moments, in the space between sleep and waking, in the silence that followed thunderstorms, in the golden light of sunset that reminded her of Mercy's eyes. They were not accusatory presences, but simply witnesses to the choices that had brought her to this moment. This haunting tale of desperation and impossible choices comes to its chilling conclusion, but the psychological horror lingers long after the final page. If this story of survival and moral compromise has captivated you, subscribe now for more tales that explore the darkest corners of the human experience. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Keturah's position? Sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that force us to examine our own capacity for both good and evil. On a warm evening in November, nearly 3 months after that terrible night, Keturah sat on her cabin steps watching Harrison play in the dirt beside her feet. At 6 months old, he was a robust, happy child who seemed to carry none of the darkness surrounding his birth. His laughter echoed across the plantation grounds, a sound of pure joy that reminded her why she had made the choices she had made. Thaddeus approached from the direction of the main house, moving with the easy confidence of a man whose world had been restored to order. He had aged in the month since Cordelia's death, but fatherhood had also given him a kind of contentment that his previous rages had never provided. "How is he today?" Thaddeus asked, settling beside them on the steps with the casual familiarity that had developed between them since Harrison's birth. "Strong and healthy," Keturah replied, watching as the baby grasped at fireflies beginning to emerge in the twilight. "He'll be walking soon, I think." "Good," Thaddeus said with satisfaction. "The Blackwater men are meant to be strong." He paused, then added more quietly, "Cordelia would be proud of what a fine boy he's becoming." Keturah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. In moments like this, when Thaddeus spoke of his dead wife with genuine love and grief, she felt the full weight of what she had taken from him. But she also felt the warm presence of the child whose life she had saved, whose laughter filled the evening air with promise. "I've been thinking," Thaddeus continued, "about your future here. About Harrison's future. He'll need someone who understands him, someone who was there from the very beginning." "What are you saying, Master?" "I'm saying that when he's old enough, I want you to teach him about medicine, about healing. It's important for a man to understand how to preserve life, not just take it." He looked down at his son, his expression soft with paternal affection.
"Maybe he can be different from the rest of us."
"Maybe he can be better?" The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. In his own way, Thaddeus was acknowledging the darkness that ran through his family line, expressing hope that his son might transcend the legacy of cruelty that had defined generations of Blackwater men. And he was entrusting that hope to Keturah, the woman who had saved his child through an act of deliberate murder. "I'll teach him whatever you want him to learn," she promised, and knew that she meant it completely. Harrison would grow up understanding the value of life, would learn to heal rather than harm. In raising him to be better than his ancestors, she might find some redemption for the choices that had brought him into the world. As darkness settled over the plantation and the fireflies began their nightly dance, Keturah held Harrison against her chest and felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a sound that had become her anchor in a world that offered few certainties. She had paid a terrible price for this moment, had sacrificed her moral innocence to ensure that this child would have a future. But as she looked into Harrison's bright eyes and saw the promise of all he might become, she knew with quiet certainty that she would make the same choice again. In a world built on suffering and oppression, sometimes the greatest act of defiance was simply ensuring that innocence survived to fight another day. The price of that defiance would follow her to her grave, but it was a price she had chosen to pay. And in the laughter of the child in her arms, in the hope that he might grow to be something better than his bloodline suggested, she found a kind of peace that no amount of moral purity could have provided. In the end, survival was not about remaining untainted by the world's darkness. It was about choosing which darkness you were willing to carry so that light might continue to exist. Keturah had made her choice, had accepted her burden, and would spend the rest of her days ensuring that the life she had saved through murder would be lived in service of something better than the circumstances of its birth. The ghosts of her past would always walk with her, but so would the living child whose future she had secured. And in that balance between the dead and the living, between guilt and hope, she found the strength to face whatever tomorrow might bring to the dark and troubled soil of Blackwater Plantation.